It's the Global History Show with Mr. Benjamin. This episode, Absolute Monarchy.
Woo! So excited!
It's Global History Show.
I can describe absolute monarchy and divine right. I can summarize how King Philip II of Spain and King Louis XIV of France concentrated power in their own hands. I can outline how Tsar Peter the Great and Czarina Catherine the Great impacted change in Russia. I can describe how Akbar the Great impacted India.
In the 1500s and 1600s, monarchs around the world sought to centralize their power. Many absolute monarchs ruled by divine right, which is the belief that their authority comes directly from God. This is the belief that God created monarchs with the skills and abilities needed to rule, or that God ruled through the monarchs. The monarch was the hand of God. Divine right increased the power and authority of the monarchs. To oppose a monarch's orders or policies was to challenge the will of God.
You shall be king.
By the 1500s, Spain was the first European kingdom to emerge as a modern European power. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had united the country, enforced religious unity, and commanded the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Ruling from 1556 to 1598, Philip II led Spain into a golden age and built an overseas empire. The gold and silver taken from the Aztec kingdom and the Inca Empire made Spain the wealthiest, foremost power in all of Europe. 1550 to 1650 was Spain's golden age. Philip II was a patron of the arts and founded academies of science and mathematics. Many works of art and literature were created, including Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, one of Europe's greatest works of literature. Philip reigned as an absolute monarch and asserted that he ruled by divine right. He saw himself as the guardian of the Roman Catholic Church. He supported the church, and the church supported him. He enforced religious unity and turned the Inquisition against Protestants and other people thought to be heretics. An Inquisition is a church court set up to try people accused of heresy. Protestants, Jews, and witches were arrested, had their wealth confiscated, were tortured, and killed. Spain remained a predominantly Roman Catholic country. Philip II fought naval battles against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean region to counter Ottoman advances. In response to Queen Elizabeth I of England ordering English ships to plunder Spanish treasure ships and loot Spanish cities in the Americas, Philip II ordered a huge Spanish armada or naval fleet to invade England. 130 ships, 20,000 men, and 2,400 pieces of artillery sailed to England. Confined space of the English Channel and high winds gave the English ships an advantage, and the Spanish Armada was defeated. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of the end of Spain as a superpower. To fund the foreign wars, the middle class were overtaxed. Jews and Muslims were expelled, and Spain was deprived of many skilled artisans and prosperous merchants. Protestants rebelled in parts of the kingdom, separating into independent kingdoms. What do you get when you cross a king and a queen? Beheaded. By the 1600s, France replaced Spain as Europe's most powerful country. Louis XIV inherited the throne of France in 1643. He became known as the Sun King, taking the sun as the symbol of his power. As the sun was the center of the solar system, so would the king be the center of France. He even starred in a performance of the first professional ballet, dressed in yellow leotards as the sun, with other dancers revolving around him. Louis's claim to absolute power was strengthened by the court preacher Bishop Jacques Bossuet, who argued that as God's representative on earth, the king had absolute authority. Louis XIV was quoted as saying, "I am the state," meaning that he was all of the authority and power of the government. He did not call meetings of the Estates General, the medieval council made up of representatives of all French social classes. He built the lavish, immense Palace of Versailles outside of Paris. He invited nobles to come live at the palace. At the palace, he held big balls and used them to concentrate his power. While nobles partied it up at the palace, Louis XIV hired middle-class bureaucrats to run their estates. In this way, Louis XIV ruled over the provinces of France, removing the competing power of the noble class. Louis XIV expanded the bureaucracy, appointed officials to collect taxes, and recruited soldiers. He organized a highly disciplined army, the strongest in Europe. France took the lead in culture and the arts. Louis XIV was a patron of the arts. His extravagant spending resulted in great government debt that would lead to revolution 2 generations later. He persecuted the Protestant Huguenots, many of whom fled to other countries. This ultimately damaged the economy of France, as many Huguenots were prosperous business people involved in foreign trade. Introducing good Queen Bess of England, King Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, Peter the Great of Russia, Catherine the Great of Russia, Akbar the Great of India, Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, and Ivan the Terrible of Russia. He needs a better publicist. Peter the Great became the Czar of Russia in 1682. He inherited a kingdom that, due to occupation by the Mongol Empire, had long been economically and culturally isolated from the kingdoms of Western Europe. Russia had missed out on the advances of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. Peter the Great was impressed by the culture and advancements he saw while traveling in Europe. He brought to Russia a group of technical experts, teachers, and soldiers he had recruited in Europe. Peter the Great began a series of policies aimed at Westernization, the adoption of Western ideas, technologies, and cultures he believed were necessary to modernize Russia. To impose these policies on Russia, he became the most autocratic of Europe's absolute monarchs, ruling with unlimited power. Peter the Great brought all Russian institutions under his control, including the Russian Orthodox Church. He forced the landowning nobles to serve the state in civilian or military positions. He passed laws that all Russian nobles had to shave their beards and wear short dress suits in place of the traditional long Russian coats. That is, dress like Europeans did in France and Great Britain. He forced nobles to attend dances, with the men and women dancing together. Traditionally, the women would have been secluded in separate rooms to the men. Peter the Great passed laws that strengthened serfdom and even spread it to parts of the empire where it had been abolished. He forced serfs to become soldiers or to work as laborers on roads, canals, and other government projects. He said, "Serf, serf." Don't they know there's no such thing as Smurfs? Peter the Great improved education, setting up academies for the study of mathematics, science, and engineering. He encouraged trade, improving waterways and canals, developing mining and textile manufacturing, and backing new trading companies. He had no mercy for any who resisted his changes. He ordered 1,000 palace guards, tortured and executed when they rebelled. He then left their rotting corpses outside the palace walls for months. He strengthened the army and built an entire navy from scratch. He declared a series of wars in an attempt to gain warm water ports for Russia. Russia was so far north that all access to the ocean and international trade was frozen for most of the year. His forces defeated Sweden to gain access to the Baltic Sea. There, he built a new capital that he named St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was to be Russia's window to the West. There was a king that was only 12 inches tall. He was an awful king, but he was an excellent ruler. Later, Catherine the Great would become Czarina of Russia and rule as a ruthless, absolute monarch. Catherine the Great codified laws and began state-sponsored education for both boys and girls. She embraced Western ideas. She further oppressed serfs. She expanded Russian borders, defeating the Ottoman Empire to gain a true warm water port in the Black Sea. Akbar the Great is an example of a non-European absolute monarch. Akbar the Great is a descendant of Genghis Khan. He and his ruling class were Muslims, but most of the people in the kingdom were Hindus. Akbar the Great was a religiously tolerant leader, leading the kingdom to peace and prosperity. So absolute monarchs concentrated power with many different methods. They used this power to achieve great and horrible things. What's that, Stan? Yeah, I guess teachers are the absolute monarchs of the classroom.
You do not have divine